Good everyone. I'm Hendrik Coetzee and I'm here with my colleague Werner Nel. We are two social scientists based at Northwest University and we do some of our work in the conservation space. So in essence we looked at the feasibility of national parks driving a development agenda. If you look at the bigger picture, you'll see that many of our protected areas, especially our national parks, are surrounded or bordered by local communities. But the big question is, to what extent can, and these communities often look at our protected areas and they have a lot of wants and needs and expectations. But the big question is, to what extent can national parks realistically and effectively drive a community development agenda? And we specifically framed our title as a question, and by show of hands, I just want to do a quick poll. Who of you think that national parks can, in fact, realistically and effectively drive a community development agenda? Okay, that's quite interesting. So about half of you think that they can, and this seems to be in line with the sentiment that is shared from across the globe. Many authors seem to think that protected areas or national parks in particular can play a role, and this idea stems from a paradigm shift away from the sort of more traditional forms of conservation. Earlier this morning, there was a mention of a fortress conservation or conservation preservation against people that later shifted to conservation for people, and sort of more contemporary approaches to conservation with people that includes both conservation objectives and also development objectives. This led to what is today widely known as community-based conservation. The underlying principle is that poor rural communities should benefit directly from conservation. And not surprising, this is also evident in some of the strategic documents that you can see from South African national parks. And specifically, if you look at strategic outcome-orientated goal number 3, where they state to foster an effective, efficient and effective and development-orientated public sector and an empowered, fair and inclusive citizenship that will enable the creation of decent employment through inclusive economic growth, vibrant, equitable and sustainable rural communities. And if you look closely, you'll see that it's actually underpinned by what is known as the government's 5 key pillars that include things like job creation, rural development, education and health, as well as reduction in levels of crime. So all sort of big imperatives and challenges that we often see in communities. Now, the benefits and challenges and costs of community-based approaches are well known. Most authors are of the opinion that at best we've achieved mixed results. There are some success stories on the one hand, but on the other hand there are also a lot of challenges. And if you look at it, it also shows that development and conservation objectives are often not, they're often incompatible. And what we also see is that the development aspects that are identified are not always based on what communities actually really want and need. On the one hand, but on the other hand, also what national parks can realistically offer based on their own expertise, capacity, resources, and that sort of thing. And it's actually quite surprising. It's a very sort of relevant and hot topic of our time, but it's never really been empirically investigated. So that's what we tried to do. And we mainly focused on 2 of the aspects. On the one hand, we looked at what are the actual needs that you find in the rural or local communities near national parks. And we looked specifically at 2 communities near Mukala National Park as a kind of a case study in order to address our sort of overarching question. We followed a modified sequential exploratory mixed method approach that consisted of 3 phases. In the first phase, we tried to identify the community needs. We then empirically verified and quantified the needs, because you'll see often if you work in communities and you ask them about their needs and wants, you hear many things, but you sort of need a way to sort of verify and quantify it so that you also get an idea of what the priorities are. And then in the third and final phase, we took the results and we asked people from SANParks and Mokala National Park specifically what they think, which of the needs they'll be able to address. The study area, Mokala National Park, is located in the Northern Cape province, near Kimberley, so more or less in the center of the country. And its two closest communities is the Richie community, actually as the crow fly just across the river, so it's fairly close. And then about 10 kilometers further on, you'll find the Rattanang community near the town of Jacobsdal, which actually happens to be located on the Free State side of the border, but they're basically the Mokala's two closest neighbors. In our first qualitative phase, we included 22 participants, which we purposefully selected. We also used snowball sampling. In the second phase, 484 participants. And there our sample was systematically taken, and then in the final phase we really struggled to get experts, people that will be able to give us a real informed opinion on what they can realistically achieve. Now if you look at the profile of our participants in the phase 2, you'll see it's more or less representative of the bigger picture in the area. The one thing that I want to point out is the very high percentage of unemployment in the area, which seemed to be a sort of a pressing need. Then data collection. In the first phase, we followed semi-structured interviews. In the second phase, we used a cross-sectional survey design. And in the final phase, we also used semi-structured interviews. But we also added a minor quantitative component just to get an idea of the ranking of what SANParks or Mokala National Park can specifically deliver on. Data analysis, first phase, thematic content analysis, some basic statistical analysis, again, combination of the two. Now, what we found is is that there's about a dozen or so typical needs that you find in the community. It ranges from things like the need for more job opportunities and employment, local conservation initiatives, economic development, health, social services, also things like improved leadership, safety and security, which we know is quite a big issue in some of the communities. Now, what is interesting, if you verify and quantify it, you'll see that the biggest need, according to these communities, is the need for more job opportunities, also healthcare services, improved infrastructure, waste management, municipal services, safety and security, community policing, and so on. Also, if you look at the averages, the means, you'll see that it was on a 5-point scale. You'll see that all of these needs are fairly high, so in a sense it sort of verifies and it shows that these are the actual needs that you do get in the community. Now, what is very interesting, if you then take this set of needs to SANParks representatives and people from the park management and so on, you get this. The pattern that emerges, you'll see that there are some of the needs that highlighted in green, that SANParks and the people from Mokala National Park think that they can realistically achieve. So there's a couple of them. In the middle, the black ones are the ones that they can more or less make a contribution to, and then the bottom half, highlighted in red, is something that they think that they won't be able to address at all. So the big message here is that, yes, there are many needs in the communities, but in a sense, we also need to be realistic in terms of what national parks can realistically achieve in the development space. Now, if we look at them more closely, you'll see, for example, what was originally identified as one of the big needs is the need for employment and job opportunities. SANParks can play a big role. You know, it's a big need. They can play a big role, especially in the form of temporary job creation. You know, things like the expanded public works projects at SANParks. They employ over 100 people at a time. Unfortunately, they're sort of short-term, but so far it looks like they are being renewed all the time. You know, so it's sort of a temporary, longer-term kind of solution. That can be where SANParks or conservation can definitely play a role. Also in terms of local conservation incentives, they can definitely play a role. This is in line with their core business, conservation, so they can definitely also make a contribution there. And then also in the skills development and training space, because for example, as part of the expanded public works, they also receive training and skills development and stuff that they can then take back to the communities and then use that to find other kinds of employment. And then, for example, local economic development, where parks can use local communities, local service providers, and so on, as part of their operations. To a lesser extent, things like agriculture. This morning we spoke about the wildlife economy and industry and so on, so they can definitely play a role. But what is very clear is that there are some things that just are too far removed from their core business and their own expertise and capacity and so on. In conclusion, I think what is clear is that, yes, SANParks and Mokala can definitely make a contribution in the community development space, but it seems that it's sort of in specific areas that they can make a contribution, and I think we must be very careful not to create expectations that we cannot deliver on, and that's basically my message. Thank you very much.